Victoria Sterling had exactly 17 minutes to deliver the rare orchid. Specimens to the 42nd floor of Cross Industries before her boss would fire her for the third time this month. The threat didn't particularly worry her anymore. Henderson's Garden Supply operated on a revolving door policy when it came to employees, but she desperately needed this job to fund her botanical research. The elevator in the gleaming Manhattan Tower seemed to crawl upward, giving Victoria precious time to admire the pristine specimens in her delivery cart. Each orchid represented months of painstaking cultivation, and she treated them like her own children. The Phalaenopsis hybrid she'd been nurturing for 8 months was finally ready for its new home in the law firm's executive suite. When the elevator doors parted with a soft chime, Victoria carefully maneuvered her cart into the marble lobby. The space was intimidating with its floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek modern art installations. But she kept her focus locked on the mission. Just 17 steps to the reception desk, hand over the delivery confirmation, and she could return to her tiny greenhouse where she belonged. That's when Damian Cross burst through the emergency stairwell doors like a man fleeing from fire itself. The collision was spectacular. Victoria's cart flew sideways, sending potting soil, ceramic shards, and delicate purple petals cascading across the pristine white marble floor. The crash echoed through the lobby like a gunshot, followed by the heartbreaking tinkle of shattered pottery. Victoria dropped to her knees immediately, her hands frantically gathering the scattered remains of her precious orchid. The root system lay exposed and vulnerable, possibly dying. 8 months of patient care destroyed in 3 seconds. How much? The voice above her was sharp, impatient. A hand appeared in her peripheral vision, already reaching for an expensive leather wallet. I'll pay for it, whatever it costs. Victoria looked up and found herself staring into the most intense gray eyes she'd ever seen. The man was tall, probably in his early 30s, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there was something desperate in his expression that had nothing to do with the broken orchid. It's not about money, Victoria said quietly, turning her attention back to the plant. She carefully lifted the main root cluster, examining it for damage. This is a hybrid Phalaenopsis that I've been developing for almost a year. It's one of a kind. The man crouched down beside her, and Victoria caught a hint of expensive cologne mixed with something else. Stress, maybe fear, I'm sorry, he said, and she was surprised by the genuine remorse in his voice. I was in a hurry. I wasn't looking where I was going. Victoria glanced at him again. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. This wasn't just some careless executive rushing to his next meeting. This was a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Might survive, she said, more to herself than to him. If I can get it back to proper growing conditions quickly enough. My name is Damian Cross. He paused as if expecting recognition. When Victoria showed none, he continued, This is my building, my company. Victoria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She'd just told the owner of Cross Industries that money couldn't fix his mistake. I'm Victoria Sterling from Henderson's Garden Supply. I was delivering this to Morrison & Associates. Victoria? He tested her name, and something in his voice made her look at him again. I have a proposition for you. Victoria carefully placed the orchid remains in a makeshift container and stood up, brushing soil from her jeans. Mr. Cross, I really need to salvage what I can of this plant. If there's a possibility of recovery, every minute counts.
Wait.
Damian stood as well, towering over her. Just hear me out. Something in his tone made her pause. There was a vulnerability there that seemed completely at odds with his powerful presence. I need someone to pose as my fiancée for 2 weeks, he said quickly, as if afraid he'd lose his nerve. It's a business arrangement. Nothing inappropriate, just appearances at a few social events and meetings. Victoria stared at him. Are you serious? Completely serious? There's a major investor, Richard Blackwood, who's very traditional, old school. He values family stability, and he's made it clear that he prefers to do business with settled men. Men with wives and families. So get a wife, Victoria said bluntly. Damian's laugh was bitter. It's not that simple. The deal has to close within 2 weeks or I lose everything. Blackwood arrives tomorrow for a series of meetings and social events. Wants to meet my family. Victoria looked around the opulent lobby, then back at Damian. You're telling me that a man who owns all this can't find a woman to pretend to be engaged to him for 2 weeks? The women in my usual social circle would see this as an opportunity for something permanent. I need someone who understands it's purely business, someone who won't get the wrong idea. Victoria felt a spark of indignation. Someone who's not good enough for your social circle, you mean? Damian had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's not what I meant. Sure it is. Victoria secured the Orchid container and started pushing her damaged cart toward the elevator. Thanks for the generous offer, but I'll pass. $100,000. Victoria's steps faltered. Slowly. $100,000 for 2 weeks of your time, Damian repeated. Plus, I'll personally ensure your orchid gets the best care possible. I'll hire the top botanist in the city if necessary. The number hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Victoria's mind raced. $100,000 would fund her research for 2 years. She could quit Henderson's focus entirely on her hybrid development program, maybe even rent proper laboratory space. Why me? I asked finally. Because you're real, Damian said simply. You're not impressed by the money or the building, or the suit. Blackwood will believe we're together because you won't be trying to impress him. Victoria studied his face, searching for deception. What she found instead was desperation so raw, it made her chest tighten. What exactly would this involve? 3 dinner parties, 2 business lunches, and a charity gala. You'd need to stay at my penthouse for the duration to maintain the illusion. Separate bedrooms, of course. And after 2 weeks, we have a very public, very amicable breakup. You walk away with your money, I close my deal, and we never see each other again. Victoria looked down at her soil-stained hands, then at the pristine marble floor still scattered with the remains of her work. Her practical mind screamed that this was insane, but another part of her whispered that sometimes insane was exactly what life demanded. I have conditions, she heard herself saying. Relief flooded Damian's features. Name them. First, I want the money held in escrow. I don't trust you not to change your mind. He nodded. Second, I want a contract that clearly outlines the boundaries of this arrangement. What I will and won't do. Agreed. Third, my orchid gets the best care possible, and if it dies, you replace my entire greenhouse with plants of equivalent value. Done. Victoria extended her hand. Then, Mr. Cross, you have yourself a fake fiancée. The moment their hands touched, something electric passed between them. Damian's grip lingered a fraction too long, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with business arrangements. Victoria pulled her hand back, suddenly aware that she might have just made the biggest mistake of her life. The penthouse was a masterpiece of glass and steel that made Victoria feel like she was living inside a fishbowl, 40 stories above Manhattan. Damian had given her the tour with the efficiency of a real estate agent, pointing out the guest suite, the kitchen she was welcome to use, the terrace garden that made her heart skip when she saw the sophisticated hydroponic system. You did this? She asked, running her fingers along the automated nutrient delivery tubes. I have many interests, Damian replied, but she caught something guarded in his expression. Their first test came 18 hours later at Blackwood's welcome dinner. Victoria had spent the morning being transformed by a stylist Damian had hired, emerging from the experience feeling like an actress preparing for a role she'd never auditioned for. The emerald green dress clung to her curves in ways that made her hyper-aware of every movement, and the shoes were instruments of torture disguised as fashion. But when she saw Damian's expression as she descended the stairs, the discomfort seemed worth it. You look stunning, he said, and there was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. Don't sound so surprised, Victoria replied, though she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Richard Blackwood was exactly what Victoria had expected from Damian's description. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of old-world charm that barely concealed a razor-sharp business mind. His wife Eleanor was a petite woman, with intelligent eyes, who seemed to see far more than she let on. So tell me, my dear, Eleanor said during the appetizer course, how did you and Damian meet? Victoria had rehearsed this moment, but under Eleanor's penetrating gaze, the practiced words felt clumsy. "He destroyed my orchid," she said instead, earning a surprised laugh from the older woman. "How wonderfully honest," Eleanor said, glancing meaningfully at her husband. "Richard, isn't it refreshing to meet a young woman who doesn't speak in corporate platitudes?" The evening progressed smoothly until Blackwood's business associate, Marcus Webb, arrived late and clearly intoxicated. Victoria watched Damian's jaw tighten as Webb made increasingly inappropriate comments, his eyes lingering on Victoria in ways that made her skin crawl. "You know, Cross," Webb slurred during dessert, "I have to admire your taste. Though I have to wonder what a beautiful woman like Victoria sees in a man who's about to lose everything." The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Marcus," Blackwood said quietly, "I think you've had enough." But Webb wasn't finished. "Come on, Richard. We all know Cross Industries is hemorrhaging money. The Hartwell project failed. The Singapore deal fell through, and now Damian's betting everything on this Blackwood partnership. Tell me, Victoria, what happens when the money runs out?" Victoria felt Damian's hand clench on the table beside her. She could see the careful composure he'd maintained all evening beginning to crack, and something protective and fierce rose up in her chest. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd learned from years of handling difficult clients, "I think you're confusing net worth with actual worth. Damian could lose every penny tomorrow and still be worth 10 of you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Webb's face flushed an ugly red, but before he could respond, Eleanor Blackwood began to applaud softly. "Beautifully said, my dear," Eleanor said. "Richard, I think we can see why Damian fell for this young woman." Later, in the privacy of the car ride home, Damian was unusually quiet. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "Do what? Defend me?" "It wasn't part of our arrangement." Victoria studied his profile in the passing streetlights. "Maybe not, but Webb was being an ass. Besides, what I said was true." Damian turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You don't even know me, Victoria. For all you know, everything Webb said could be accurate, is it?" A long pause, some of it. Victoria felt something shift between them in that moment. A crack in the careful walls they'd both built around this arrangement. She was supposed to be playing a role, but sitting here beside him, seeing the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide, it felt increasingly real. "Damian," she said softly, "what aren't you telling me?" But he'd already turned back to the window, and the wall was firmly back in place. "Get some rest," he said as they pulled into the building's underground garage. "Tomorrow's the charity gala. It's going to be a long night." As Victoria lay in the luxurious guest bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a precipice. The smart thing would be to maintain her professional distance, collect her money at the end of 2 weeks, and walk away. But as she drifted off to sleep, Victoria couldn't ignore the truth that was becoming harder to deny with each passing hour. She was falling for a man who'd hired her to pretend to love him, and she had no idea if anything she was feeling was real or just part of the most elaborate performance of her life. The charity gala was held in the Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dender, and Victoria had never felt more out of place in her life. The borrowed diamond necklace felt heavy against her throat, and the flowing navy gown made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. But it was the way Damian looked at her that made her breath catch. There was something different in his eyes tonight, something that went beyond their carefully orchestrated charade. "You're staring," she murmured as they moved through the crowd of Manhattan's elite. "I'm playing my part," he replied, but his voice was rougher than usual. The evening was proceeding flawlessly until Victoria excused herself to the restroom and overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "I have to hand it to Cross," a woman's voice was saying. "Hiring an actress to play his fiancée is brilliant. Blackwood completely believes it, an actress," another voice responded. "Are you sure?" Marcus Webb did some digging. "The woman's name is Victoria Sterling, and she works for a garden supply company. But apparently she's done some amateur theater." Webb thinks Cross found her through some casting agency that specializes in corporate role-playing. Victoria's hands trembled as she gripped the marble countertop. The conversation continued, but she couldn't hear it over the roaring in her ears. She wasn't special. She wasn't chosen because she was real or honest or different. She was just another hired performer selected because she was good at pretending. When she returned to the ballroom, Damian was deep in conversation with Blackwood near the temple's ancient stones. The sight of him so confident and commanding in his tuxedo made her chest ache with a pain she hadn't expected. Victoria Eleanor Blackwood appeared at her elbow. "You look pale, dear. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Victoria managed. But Eleanor's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Walk with me," the older woman said, linking their arms and guiding her away from the crowd. They found a quiet alcove overlooking the museum's courtyard, and Eleanor turned to face her with surprising directness. "How long have you been in love with him?" Victoria's carefully constructed composure cracked. "I don't know what you mean." "My dear child, I've been married for 43 years. No. I know what real love looks like, and I know what performance looks like. What I've seen between you and Damian isn't performance." Victoria felt tears threaten and blinked them back fiercely. "It doesn't matter what I feel. This is all just business to him." Eleanor's expression softened. "Is it? Because the way that young man looks at you suggests otherwise." "You don't understand," Victoria said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He hired me. This whole thing is fake. I'm just playing a role." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "And what role is he playing?" The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. Before she could answer, Damian appeared in the alcove doorway, his face tense. "Victoria, we need to go. Now." Something in his tone made both women turn. Eleanor excused herself with a meaningful look at Victoria, leaving them alone. "What's wrong?" Victoria asked. "Blackwood wants to move up the timeline. He's flying back to London tomorrow night, which means he wants to finalize everything at lunch tomorrow. If this doesn't work, you lose everything," Victoria finished. Damian nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, Victoria. No, this wasn't part of the plan." She studied his face in the dim lighting, seeing the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Whatever game he thought he was playing, whatever calculation had led him to choose her, none of it mattered in this moment. Because the fear in his eyes was real, and her need to protect him from it was even more real. "Then we make it work," she said simply. Something shifted in Damian's expression. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Victoria," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to know something." "What?" "This stopped being fake for me 3 days ago." Before she could respond, his hands were cupping her face, and his lips were on hers. The kiss was desperate, hungry, full of all the words they hadn't been able to say. Victoria melted into him, her hands fisting in his jacket as she kissed him. Back with equal fervor, and they broke apart. Both were breathing hard. "Damian," she whispered, but he pressed his forehead against hers. "I know this complicates everything. I know it's not what you signed up for. But I can't pretend anymore that this is just business." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought about the conversation she'd overheard, about the careful walls she'd built around her feelings, about all the reasons this was impossible. Then she thought about the way he'd looked when he'd destroyed her orchid, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd asked for her help, the gentleness in his voice. When he'd defended her to Webb, "It stopped being fake for me, too," she admitted. The relief in his eyes was almost heartbreaking. He kissed her again, softer this time, and Victoria allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, something real could grow from the ashes of their careful deception. But as they walked back to rejoin the gala, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's lunch with Blackwood would change everything, one way or another. The lunch meeting was held in Blackwood's hotel suite. It's an elegant space overlooking Central Park. Victoria sat beside Damian at the polished mahogany table, acutely aware of the documents spread between them and the weight of everything hanging in the balance. Blackwood had been reviewing contracts for the better part of an hour when he finally looked up, his shrewd eyes moving between Damian and Victoria. "The numbers look good," he said slowly. "Your projections are solid. The market analysis is thorough. But I have to ask, Damian, why do you need this so desperately? Damian's hand stilled on his water glass. Sir, my research shows that Cross Industries is in more trouble than you initially let on. The Hartwell project didn't just fail, it nearly bankrupted you. You're not looking for an investor, you're looking for a lifeline. Victoria felt Damian tense beside her, saw the careful composure he'd maintained throughout this entire charade beginning to fracture. Richard Eleanor interjected gently from her seat by the window. Perhaps directness would be more productive. Blackwood nodded. Very well. Damian, I'm not interested in throwing money at a sinking ship, no matter how charming the captain, or how lovely his fiancée. I need to know that you have the judgment and integrity to weather whatever storms are coming. The silence stretched taut. Victoria could practically hear Damian's internal struggle, the war between his pride and his desperation. Oh, you're right, Damian said finally, his voice quiet but steady.
Us.
Cross Industries is in serious trouble.
Us.
The Hartwell project failed because I trusted the wrong people and ignored warning signs I should have seen. The Singapore deal fell through because I was arrogant and underestimated the cultural complexities involved. Victoria watched Blackwood's expression, but the older man's face remained unreadable. I've made mistakes, Damian continued. But I've learned from every single one of them. This company represents 4 generations of my family's work, and I'll be damned if I let it die, because I was too proud to admit when I was wrong. And what about your personal life? Blackwood asked, his gaze shifting to Victoria. How do I know this engagement isn't just another calculated business decision? Victoria felt her heart stop. This was it, the moment where their carefully constructed lie would either save them or destroy them both. But before Damian could speak, Victoria found herself rising from her chair. Because it's not, she said, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. Mr. Blackwood, I need to tell you something, Victoria, Damian said urgently, but she held up a hand. This engagement started as a business arrangement, she continued, ignoring Damian's sharp intake of breath. Damian hired me to play the role of his fiancée because he thought that's what you wanted to see. A settled man with a stable relationship? Eleanor leaned forward, interest sharpening her features. But somewhere along the way, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger, it stopped being about business. It stopped being about what anyone else wanted to see. It became about what we felt for each other. She turned to look at Damian, seeing the mixture of terror and admiration in his gray eyes. The truth is, Mr. Blackwood, I fell in love with a man who was desperate enough to hire a stranger to pretend to love him. And he fell in love with a woman who was broke enough to take the Job. We're both a little broken, both a little desperate, and both absolutely terrible at trusting people. Victoria took a shaky breath. But what we have now is real. It's messier and more complicated than either of us planned, but real. And if that's not the kind of stability you're looking for in a business partner, then maybe this isn't the right partnership. For anyone. The room fell silent. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Damian's stunned gaze on her profile. Finally, Richard Blackwood began to laugh. Eleanor, he said to his wife, didn't I tell you this was going to be interesting? Eleanor smiled. You did indeed. Blackwood stood and walked around the table to where Victoria and Damian sat. In 40 years of business, I've seen every kind of performance, every kind of manipulation, every kind of calculated charm. But what I just witnessed was something I see very rarely. Courage. He extended his hand to Damian. You hired an actress to fool me, and instead, you found someone willing to risk everything to tell me the truth. That kind of judgment, that kind of integrity, is exactly what I'm looking for in a partner. Damian stood slowly, his hand shaking, slightly as he gripped Blackwood's. Does this mean it means you have a deal? Blackwood said. And it means you're both invited to dinner tonight to celebrate properly. 3 hours later, Victoria stood on the terrace of Damian's penthouse, still wearing the simple blue dress she'd chosen for the lunch meeting. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I can't believe you did that, Damian said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. I can't believe it worked, Victoria replied, leaning back against his chest. Do you regret it, telling the truth? Victoria turned in his arms, studying the face she'd come to know so well. Only thing I regret is that it took me so long to realize that what we have is worth more than any amount of money. Damian's smile was soft, genuine, completely unlike the careful composure she'd first seen in that marble lobby. So what happens now? Now. Victoria reached up to cup his face in her hands. Now we figure out how to build something real together. No contracts, no conditions, no predetermined ending date. Just us, just us. When he kissed her, Victoria could taste promise and possibility and the sweet relief of finally being exactly where she belonged. Behind them, through the glass doors, she could see her rescued orchid blooming in its place of honor on the windowsill. Its purple, petals unfurled in the dying light. Some things, Victoria thought as Damian deepened the kiss, were worth waiting for. Some things were worth the risk of falling. And some collisions, no matter how unexpected, were exactly what you needed to find your way home. The end asterisk like this. Video, if the story touched your heart, subscribe for more emotional tales. And share with someone who believes in the power of true love. And let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.